Rome, an empire so vast, so dazzling, so carefully arranged that it convinced itself it could never end. And yet it did. Not in a single day of fire and swords, but in a long, slow evening, when the lamps of empire went out one by one. Tonight, we'll drift together into that twilight, the gentle decay of the Roman Empire, where borders softened, baths grew colder, and bureaucrats wrote themselves into exhaustion, while ordinary people quietly adapted to a changing world. Before we begin, take a moment to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. If you enjoyed these slow wanderings through forgotten history, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find comfort here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is drifting into sleep from one corner of the world to another. Now, let's step gently into the long goodbye of Rome. Rome did not collapse like a tower struck by lightning. It did not vanish in a single violent heartbeat. Instead, it exhaled, slowly, quietly. The empire slid into its twilight the way a candle gutters out, flickering, studying, flickering again, until one day the flame is gone. The eternal city was not destroyed so much as it was allowed to age, to creak, to sigh, to fade into the background of the very world it had once dominated. And the Romans themselves, for the most part, did not experience this as a single catastrophe. They woke each morning, stretched their arms, went about their business. The decline came softly, like a change in the seasons. A tax collector demanded more than last year. A bathhouse that had once steamed with hot water now gave only lukewarm comfort. A temple's paint flaked, unretouched. The empire's end was not a thunderclap. It was mildew in the baths. It was weeds between paving stones. It was silence where once there had been the confident hum of aqueducts. In its youth, Rome had been a marvel of rhythm. The aqueducts sang with water cascading over miles of arches. The legions marched, precise as clockwork, defending borders that seemed unshakable. Grain ships slid into harbors, feeding the urban millions. Emperors decreed, senators debated, magistrates recorded. The whole machine hummed like a well-oiled organ, pumping the music of empire across 3 continents. It felt eternal. But eternity has its own schedule. Slowly, the rhythm slowed. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Rome's marble still gleamed, its processions still marched, its citizens still boasted of being Roman. Yet, the hum had changed. The aqueducts leaked. The armies recruited outsiders who spoke in accents not entirely Latin. The senators still wrapped themselves in purple-edged togas, but their debates mattered less, echoing in chambers where fewer listened. To the farmer in Gaul, Rome's decline meant his wheat went to tax collectors instead of markets. To the merchant in North Africa, it meant fewer ships arrived from Italy, and more barbarian tribes demanded payment at ports. To the noble in Rome, it meant watching emperors move their courts away to Ravenna or Milan, leaving the old capital like a once-beloved villa now rarely visited. Historians like Ammianus Marcellinus, who lived through the twilight, noticed the contradictions. He described Rome's magnificence in reverent tones, but also criticized its vanity. Its citizens still dressed in gold-threaded silk, indulged in grand feasts, and obsessed over games even as the empire's foundations crumbled. To Ammianus, Rome was a tired giant in fine clothing, beautiful still, but weary and vulnerable. Imagine walking through the Forum in those years. The temples still stand, though their priests now sometimes share space with Christian bishops. The Senate still convenes, though the hall feels emptier. Statues still rise, though many are broken-nosed, missing an arm, left unrepaired. The aqueducts still spill water, but less reliably. Grass grows where once triumphant legions marched. The sound of empire is quieter, thinner, less certain. Rome's twilight was not just political, it was emotional. The empire had built itself upon certainty, the certainty that its roads led everywhere, that its baths steamed always, that its armies kept the world in order. As that certainty unraveled, so did Rome's sense of itself. Citizens continued to call themselves Roman long after the machinery that made that identity real had faltered. They clung to forms, the titles, the rituals, the ceremonies, even when the substance had disappeared. By the time the boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476, much of the empire had already slipped away. That moment is remembered as the fall of Rome, but in truth, it was more of a formality. The empire had already ended in slow degrees, through crumbling baths, unpaid soldiers, broken statues, and citizens who no longer looked to Rome as the beating heart of their world. And perhaps that is why Rome's twilight still haunts us. It was not a crash, but a long goodbye. It was not fire and ruin, but sighs and silence. It was the sound of an empire drifting into sleep.
Rome, at its height, loved to draw lines. Clear, unshakable boundaries carved across the map like a stern parent declaring, "This far and no farther." To be Roman was to know precisely where the empire ended, where civilization stopped, and where wilderness and barbarism supposedly began. The legions built stone walls, dotted with watchtowers and forts, to make the invisible visible. Hadrian's Wall in Britain, the limes in Germany, frontier defenses stretching from the sands of Africa to the rivers of Mesopotamia. But borders, like people, rarely age gracefully. By the time Rome was easing into its twilight, those once defiant lines no longer shouted, they whispered. The walls still stood, yes, but with fewer men patrolling them. The fortresses still dotted the landscape, but their garrisons were thinner, and the soldiers spoke languages that were not always Latin. Sometimes they were Romans in name only, hired Goths, Franks, or Vandals, serving under the eagle standard because it paid better than raiding. It is tempting to imagine the frontier as a sharp edge, a great Roman curtain against the dark unknown. But in truth, as the centuries wore on, the edges blurred. Barbarians didn't just knock at Rome's doors, they strolled through them, traded across them, settled beside them, and eventually within them. The frontier, once a place of confrontation, became a place of negotiation. A farmer in Gaul might sell grain to a Roman officer in the morning and trade with a Germanic herder in the evening. The empire's borderland was less a wall than a sieve. This was not necessarily new. For centuries, Rome had absorbed outsiders, turning enemies into allies and allies into citizens. The empire had a genius for assimilation. But in the twilight years, the balance shifted. Rome needed outsiders more than outsiders needed Rome. Armies were no longer filled by proud Italian recruits or eager provincials. They were patched together by treaties with tribes, promises of land, and gold payments to keep the peace. The official language for these arrangements was polite, foederati, federated allies. In practice, it meant that groups once beyond the frontier were now woven into the empire as semi-independent partners. They fought Rome's battles, yes, but they also held leverage. Whole peoples were resettled within imperial borders, like the Visigoths, who were first invited in as refugees fleeing the Huns. The empire, which had once dictated the terms of the world, now found itself negotiating, coaxing, appeasing. Imagine standing on the banks of the Rhine around the year 400. The river still flows as a boundary between Roman Gaul and the Germanic lands beyond. Roman watchtowers still rise above the water, and standards still flutter in the wind. But the scene feels different. Some of the men at the watchtowers wear Roman armor patched with local repairs. Their Latin is clumsy, their loyalty conditional. Across the river, Germanic traders arrive with furs, cattle, or amber, not as invaders, but as partners in the fragile dance of exchange. The river is still a frontier, but its voice is quieter now, less a roar of defiance, more a murmur of compromise. The blurring of borders created strange ironies. Men who once fought Rome with sword and spear now rose through its military ranks. Roman generals bore names that did not sound particularly Roman. Stilicho, one of the most famous commanders of the late empire, was half Vandal by birth. To many Romans, this seemed scandalous. To others, it was simply the reality of survival. If the empire's borders were porous, then so too were its definitions of identity. Who was Roman? By the 5th century, the answer was less clear than ever. And yet the people living in the shadow of these borders did not always see decline. For them, life went on. Markets bustled, fields were plowed, villages sprouted near fortresses. For ordinary provincials, the empire's gradual weakening meant new neighbors, new customs, sometimes new rulers, but rarely the sense of living in the end times. It was not apocalypse, it was adjustment. The frontier softened, and with it so too did the idea of Rome as something singular and untouchable. Historians later looked back and called this the beginning of the invasions. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, and Huns all pressed against Rome's borders and eventually crossed them. But for the people of the time, it was not so much an invasion as a migration. Whole families, tribes, and communities moved, driven by hunger, fear, or opportunity. The empire's twilight was not a tale of enemies storming the gates, but of neighbors arriving, settling, intermingling. And as borders softened, so too did Rome's authority. The emperor in Ravenna or Constantinople could still issue decrees about the frontiers, but their force was diluted by distance and compromise. Local generals, local landowners, even local bishops began to matter more than the emperor's distant voice. Rome's frontier, once a clear edge of power, became a patchwork of shifting loyalties. There is a haunting poetry to this. The empire that once boasted of being eternal, of building walls that marked the edge of the civilized world, ended not by being shattered from without, but by dissolving from within. The frontiers became less like fortresses and more like landscapes of shared survival, where Roman and barbarian were less enemies and more uneasy neighbors. If you were to walk along Hadrian's Wall in its final centuries, you would not see the crisp, martial order of legionary camps filled with gleaming armor. You would see sheep grazing beside half-abandoned forts, children playing where soldiers once stood guard, traders from both sides exchanging goods at gates that had once shut firmly against strangers. The wall still stretched across the landscape, but its meaning had faded. It was no longer a symbol of Rome's strength, but of its memory. The Roman frontier whispered instead of roared. It was still there in stone and in ritual, but its power had drained away like water leaking from a cracked aqueduct. And in that whisper, the empire revealed its gentlest truth, that even walls, no matter how solid, are only as strong as the belief behind them. The empire's edges blurred, and in that blurring, Rome itself began to fade.
If the Roman frontier whispered instead of roared, the Roman baths murmured as they cooled. For centuries, the bathhouse was not just a place to wash. It was the empire in miniature, ordered, ritualized, predictable, indulgent. Every town worth its salt had one. Marble steps worn smooth by sandals, mosaics glimmering beneath the water, the hiss of steam rising from hypocaust systems, and the low murmur of conversation, where citizens debated politics or whispered gossip between plunges. The baths were not about hygiene alone. They were a performance of Romanness. To bathe was to belong, to reaffirm your place in the great machinery of empire. Soldiers bathed, senators bathed, merchants bathed. Even the poor, with a coin or two, might wash in public waters that outshone the private tubs of kings in other lands. But by the twilight years, the water was cooler. The tiles cracked. The great fires that heated the hypocausts burned less reliably, because wood was harder to come by, and taxes meant to maintain the baths were diverted elsewhere, perhaps to pay soldiers on the frontier, perhaps to bribe a restless tribe into temporary peace. Imagine walking into a bathhouse in the 5th century. The building still looms, its arches still proud. The mosaics still glimmer faintly, though some tiles are missing, chipped, forgotten. The water is there, yes, but lukewarm. The furnace rooms below are understaffed. The slaves or workers less numerous than before. The air smells less of cedar oil and more of mildew. Patrons still come, still strip, still dip their toes into the tepidarium, still talk, but there is less laughter, less certainty. Something has shifted. For centuries, the baths had symbolized abundance. Rome's aqueducts poured water into cities with such extravagance that fountains gushed in courtyards and basins overflowed in the streets. To bathe daily, to soak in hot pools, to feel the hum of water echo through stone chambers. This was civilization. This was proof that Rome was eternal. But now the aqueducts themselves groaned under neglect. Some had been cut by invaders, others crumbled by time, still others deliberately sabotaged in sieges. Without their steady gush, baths dried up, fountains ran empty, and what had once been ordinary luxury became rare. There is a strange intimacy in the way luxury fades. People do not always notice it vanish in a single stroke. Instead, they adjust. The water is cooler today? Perhaps the firewood was damp. The mosaic broken? Perhaps tomorrow it will be fixed. The plunge less invigorating, the steam room colder. Perhaps it is only a passing inconvenience. Decline, after all, rarely announces itself. It creeps in, disguising itself as temporary discomfort. Yet there were those who saw the baths not as a loss, but as excess finely chastened. Christian writers of the late Empire often spoke critically of bathing culture. To them, the endless steaming pools were not symbols of civilization, but of vanity. The baths, with their statues of naked gods and their social frivolity, were tied to pagan habits. Perhaps, they suggested, it was fitting that they grew cold as Rome shifted toward new faith and new priorities. And so the baths, which once central to the Roman rhythm of life, began to change meaning. Where once they were centers of civic pride, they became relics of a fading order. Some were repurposed. The great baths of Diocletian and Rome would one day be transformed into a Christian basilica. Others became quarries, their stones carted off to build churches or fortifications. Others simply stood as husks, echoing with pigeons rather than the laughter of bathers. For ordinary people, the loss of the baths was more than an inconvenience. It was the shrinking of their world. The bathhouse had been a meeting place, a daily ritual, a communal comfort in the hum of empire. Without it, life became smaller, colder, rougher. A man who once soaked after labor now washed quickly at home, if water could be hauled. A woman who once strolled through the bath's warm corridors now tended to chores without that brief interlude of relaxation. The decline of the baths was the decline of a shared identity. Archaeologists today sometimes walk among the ruins of these bathhouses and remark on their size, vast chambers where echoes stretch, hypocaust floors where fires once roared. To us, they seem like marvels, relics of impossible abundance. But to the Romans of the twilight, they were shadows, reminders of what was once ordinary and was now exceptional, fading, gone. The cooling baths tell us something essential about Rome's twilight. It was not the loss of empire in the abstract that people felt most keenly. It was the small, daily erosions of comfort, the cooler water, the fewer coins in the purse, the longer walks to fetch wood or water. Civilization's collapse was not an explosion, but a thinning of fabric, until life was patched together with fewer luxuries and more compromises. And yet there is beauty in this gentle decay. The baths did not vanish entirely. In some towns, local effort kept them running for generations. In others, new rulers, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Byzantians, restored them briefly, recognizing their value. And in the imagination of Europe, the memory of the Roman bath never faded. Medieval kings, when they built their rare, humble bathhouses, did so in imitation of Rome. Renaissance architects would dream of the great arches of Diocletian and Caracalla when they raised their own public works. Even as the waters cooled, the idea of the Roman bath stayed warm in memory. So perhaps we can think of the cooling baths not simply as a loss, but as a transition from a world where luxury was daily and taken for granted to a world where luxury was remembered, longed for, mythologized. The steam may have faded, but the story lingered, wafting like vapor into the centuries that followed. Rome's twilight was not only fought on borders or written in decrees. It was soaked daily in the baths that cooled, reminding everyone that nothing, not even steaming water beneath marble domes, is eternal.
If Rome could no longer roar with its legions or dazzle with its steaming baths, it could still shuffle its papers. In the twilight years, as marble cracked and aqueducts groaned, bureaucracy swelled. The empire that had once been forged by generals and soldiers was now sustained, or smothered, by bureaucrats. An army of clerks, tax assessors, notaries, scribes, and administrators fanned out across the provinces, armed not with spears, but with scrolls, wax tablets, and an unquenchable appetite for signatures. Rome had always loved order. Its roads stretched like veins across the empire. Its census counted heads. Its legions ticked off their rations. Its tax collectors tallied every bushel of grain. But in the later centuries, this love hardened into obsession. The machinery of empire grew so heavy with paperwork that one almost wonders if Rome drowned less in barbarian invasions and more in the weight of its own files. To be Roman in the 4th or 5th century was to feel this paperwork press upon you. Taxes were no longer simply coins handed to a collector. They were assessed with terrifying thoroughness in wheat, wine, olive oil, animals, even labor. The empire cataloged its citizens down to the number of vines in a field, the exact age of a draft animal, the acreage of a plowed plot, and it demanded tribute accordingly. The tax collectors, too, had changed. They were no longer the proud magistrates of the Republic, nor the enterprising equestrians of earlier centuries. By the twilight, many were petty officials, often corrupt, sometimes desperate, squeezing the last drop from citizens who had little left to give. Ammianus Marcellinus describes tax officials descending on villages like wolves, stripping peasants of grain until they fled into forests to escape. The empire still lived, but it lived off the marrow of its people. And yet, paradoxically, even as the empire weakened militarily, its bureaucracy thickened. Each emperor added layers of officials, ministries, and titles, creating a paper empire that looked impressive on parchment but struggled in practice. There were counts of the sacred largesse, masters of the offices, prefects of the anana, quaestors of the palace. their duties multiplied like rabbits, often overlapping, sometimes contradicting, but always accompanied by scrolls, seals, and long queues of citizens waiting for permission, exemption, or pardon. One can imagine the scene. A provincial farmer trudges into a dusty town hall to plead with a scribe over the weight of his tax burden. The room is filled with others like him, each clutching documents, each praying for leniency. The scribe, ink-stained and weary, dips his pen, writes another line, sighs, seals the scroll, and gestures to the next in line. Outside, the walls of the empire tremble. Inside, the quill scratches steadily on. It would be easy to mock this bureaucratic empire, to imagine the last Romans busily shuffling papers while barbarians rattled at the gates. But for many, this paperwork was Rome itself. The documents and decrees gave shape to the idea of order, even when the order itself was crumbling. A barbarian chieftain might raid a village, but the imperial scribe could still issue a receipt. A fort might fall, but the tax ledgers remained intact. Rome endured not in its armies, but in its administration. And here lies the irony. Bureaucracy prolonged the empire even as it hollowed it. Without its scribes and officials, Rome might have fractured much earlier. The paperwork kept provinces tied together, taxes flowing, grain shipments moving, armies barely paid. But the cost was alienation. Citizens who once felt pride in being Roman now felt only resentment toward the endless demands of faceless officials. Rome was no longer a glorious identity. It was a tax bill. Christian writers of the period sometimes interpreted this as divine justice. The empire, they said, had become obsessed with worldly wealth and records, tallying olives and coins instead of souls. Its bureaucracy was a symptom of spiritual decline, a labyrinth of parchment distracting from higher truths. Whether or not one agrees, the effect was real. The more Rome wrote, the less Rome inspired. Imagine a late imperial office. Scrolls piled high on wooden shelves, wax tablets cluttering desks, scribes hunched over, murmuring dictations, their pens squeaking on parchment, lamps burning low, their smoke staining the ceilings. Outside, the world shifted, migrations, battles, sieges. But inside, the scribes continued their eternal labor, as if Rome could be saved by ink alone. It is strangely poetic. A civilization that conquered the world with swords spent its final centuries defending itself with paperwork. Even emperors were not spared from this bureaucratic flood. Constantine, Valentinian, Theodosius all had to wade through reports, petitions, complaints, and tax registers. Imperial decrees in the Codex Theodosius reveal an obsession with regulating every detail: how much a soldier could requisition from civilians, what rank deserved which clothing, what penalties befell a missing tax payment. The sheer volume of laws in the late empire testifies not to strength, but to anxiety. A state that writes so much is a state struggling to control a world slipping beyond its grasp. And yet, for all its absurdity, the bureaucracy also preserved something remarkable. Without those scribes, without those scrolls, we might know little of Rome's twilight. Their records, their obsessive documentation, their piles of parchment, these are the reason we can reconstruct the texture of late Roman life. In their weariness, their ink-stained hands unwittingly saved the memory of the empire they served. So, the Roman twilight was not only fought at borders or mourned in baths, it was written, line by line, decree by decree, tax by tax, in the hands of bureaucrats who believed, perhaps desperately,
that order could be maintained if only the paperwork was complete. The fall of Rome, then, was not a sudden silence. It was the sound of quills scratching until the ink ran dry.
For centuries, Rome was not just a city. It was the axis upon which the known world turned. To be Roman was to believe that all roads led here, all victories paraded here, all emperors crowned and remembered here. Its 7 hills rose like an altar, its marble shone like a second sun. Cicero once declared that Rome was the light of the world. To enter the city in its prime was to feel as if civilization had a single heartbeat, and it pulsed from the Tiber. But by the empire's twilight, Rome had grown quieter. Not empty, not ruined, not yet a corpse, but less alive. The emperors had already abandoned it as their capital, first to Milan, then to Ravenna, safer cities, closer to the frontiers where crises demanded their attention. Rome was still symbolic, still sacred, still the eternal city, but it no longer commanded the empire. It was like a retired general, respected, admired, but no longer leading the army. Walk its streets in the 4th or 5th century, and the grandeur is still there, though cracked at the edges. The Colosseum towers over the city still, its arches gaping like a jaw of stone. The Forum still holds its temples and basilicas, though ivy creeps between columns. Senators still gather in the Curia, though their debates echo more faintly. Statues still gleam, though some are toppled, melted, or carted off. The city of 1,000,000 souls in its prime had shrunk, not to silence, but to something humbler, a quieter hum, a softer glow. Rome's population, once teeming with close to 1,000,000 in the age of Augustus, had dwindled by the twilight centuries to a fraction of that number. Some estimates suggest as few as 100,000. Whole neighborhoods, once alive with taverns and workshops, now lay half abandoned, their insulae crumbling, their streets less crowded. The noise of empire, the carts, the hammers of the gossip of 100 languages was muted. Rome was still immense, but it felt hollow. And yet, paradoxically, it was still revered. For pilgrims, Rome remained the city of saints and martyrs as Christianity fastened itself to its bones. The tombs of Peter and Paul drew visitors from across the empire. Basilicas rose alongside temples, their apses glowing with mosaics that outshone the fading paint of Jupiter's shrines. The city was shifting identities, no longer the beating heart of imperial conquest, but the sacred center of a new faith. This shift brought strange juxtapositions. A senator in his toga might pass a monk in his simple habit. A pagan priest might hurry past a Christian procession chanting hymns. The Pantheon, once dedicated to the gods of Rome, now echoed with Christian prayers. Old stones found new voices. Rome itself was being rewritten. But the city also suffered. In 410, Alaric and his Visigoths marched into Rome, and for 3 days the eternal city was plundered. The shock reverberated across the world. Rome had been sacked before, by Gauls centuries earlier, but never in the memory of anyone alive. To contemporaries, it felt like the unthinkable had happened. The eternal city violated, its treasures stolen, its citizens slain or enslaved. St. Jerome, writing in Bethlehem, exclaimed that when Rome fell, the whole world collapsed with it. And yet, when the smoke cleared, Rome still stood. Its buildings still rose. Its basilicas still glowed.
its people still lived. The sack was not annihilation, but humiliation. A reminder that even marble could be broken, even eternity could be bruised. Rome endured, but as a wounded queen rather than an invincible goddess. In the decades that followed, other sacks came. Vandals in 455, Ostrogoths later still. Each left scars, but none erased Rome entirely. Rome survived, but smaller, older, more fragile. Its aqueducts were cut, and some were never restored. Its grain supply faltered, and famine crept in. The senators who had once commanded legions now presided over decline, clinging to titles that meant less and less. And yet to walk through Rome in those centuries was still to feel awe. The ruins of greatness are not like the ruins of obscurity. Even in decline, Rome dwarfed imagination. Its columns, though cracked, soared higher than most men would ever see. Its forums, though weed-strewn, stretched broader than the marketplaces of other cities. Its amphitheaters, though scarred, could swallow whole towns within their shadows. Visitors still gasped, still whispered, still believed they had stepped into something larger than life. There is a strange poignancy in the city's twilight. For those who lived there, decline was not just abstract politics or distant invasions. It was daily life. It was water carried further because aqueducts no longer ran. It was bread scarcer because shipments faltered. It was marble flaking, streets less swept, guards less vigilant. Rome was Rome, but thinner, dimmer, gentler. To later generations, the fall of Rome would be imagined as a sudden catastrophe, a single apocalyptic event when barbarians stormed the gates. But for those who lived it, Rome was never destroyed in a day. It lingered. It transformed. It endured, even as its grandeur softened. The city of empire became the city of faith. The capital of conquest became the capital of memory. Rome's twilight was not only about fading borders, cooling baths, or bureaucratic burdens. It was also about the city itself, still vast, still monumental, but hollowing out, like a shell that once held a mighty creature, now curled into slumber. And perhaps that is why Rome, even in decline, still captivates us. It did not fall. It dimmed. It whispered. And in its whisper, the memory of empire found its echo.
It is tempting to imagine that empires collapse in fire and thunder, with barbarian hordes surging over walls and flames rising behind them. Yet more often, the story is quieter, slower, and far less cinematic. Rome's collapse was not the sudden shattering of marble. It was the slow softening of parchment. Bureaucracy, that dull, invisible tide of scrolls, signatures, and delays, smothered Rome long before spears pierced its borders. The Romans were great builders, yes, aqueducts, roads, amphitheaters, but they were also great builders of administration, of forms, of regulations, of offices upon offices stacked like layers of plaster until the structure began to sag under its own weight. By the 4th century, the empire was wrapped in so many officials, secretaries, and clerks that the government sometimes resembled a bloated beast whose limbs no longer obeyed its brain. At the center of this bureaucratic labyrinth stood the emperor, or rather the idea of the emperor. The living man himself might be strong or weak, charismatic or invisible,
but by the later centuries he was increasingly just a symbol at the top of a pyramid of endless scribes. Edicts traveled down like whispers passed along in a crowd, distorted, delayed, sometimes lost entirely before they reached their intended destination. A law proclaimed in Ravenna could take months to be copied, carried, and enforced in North Africa. By the time it arrived, circumstances had shifted, or the parchment had been filed away under some magistrate's wine jug, forgotten beneath a pile of other decrees. Imagine it, a citizen of Gaul, weary from raids and taxation, trudging into a provincial office to petition for relief. He finds not one official, but layers of them, a minor scribe who passes him to a deputy, who passes him to a notary, who directs him toward an office whose clerk has gone to lunch. Each wears the air of authority, each stamps his wax seal on some tablet, but none seem able to offer actual help. The empire had once prided itself on efficiency, on the crisp discipline of its legions and its laws. Now it resembled a waiting room that stretched across continents, filled with tired voices muttering that the proper form had not yet been signed. Taxation, the lifeblood of this bureaucratic empire, became increasingly cruel. In earlier centuries, taxes had supported roads, armies, grain doles, and spectacles. By the twilight years, taxation became less about service and more about survival of the system itself. Whole offices existed to collect taxes that would then fund the very offices that collected them. Villages were squeezed dry, not only to feed soldiers, but to pay the salaries of the men who filed reports about how many soldiers there were. This was not merely inefficiency, it was suffocation. Small landowners, unable to keep up with taxes, abandoned their fields. Laws tried to chain peasants to their land, forbidding them from leaving lest the tax burden slip away. It was, in a way, the birth pangs of medieval serfdom, a population frozen in place by bureaucratic decree, paying tribute not for protection, but for the maintenance of scrolls in a distant office. Even the army was ensnared in this web. Once, soldiers had been hardened legionaries, loyal to Rome itself. By the late Empire, recruitment often fell to officials who cared more for filling quotas on paper than for raising effective fighters. Lists were ticked, scrolls were sealed, numbers looked good in the archives, but the men themselves were sometimes farmers with little training, conscripts dragged from villages, or even hired mercenaries with questionable loyalties. Bureaucrats produced armies on parchment, reality produced something far less sturdy. Of course, the empire still produced law codes, decrees, and compilations of wisdom. The Theodosian Code, issued in the 5th century, gathered laws into a single corpus. On the surface, it seemed like triumph, the majesty of Roman law preserved in neat Latin. But beneath it lurked the quiet truth. Laws were recorded because they were no longer consistently obeyed. To write them down was, ironically, a confession that the old, living discipline of Rome had faded. A law carved into stone endures, yes, but a law constantly recopied onto parchment suggests something more fragile, a system trying to remind itself that it still exists. There is something almost poetic, if one is in the mood for gentle melancholy, about an empire of swords undone by an empire of scrolls. Rome had once conquered through marching boots and glinting steel. In its twilight, it conquered itself with ink, wax, and seals, until decisions bogged down, responses lagged, and the machinery of empire turned in slow, grinding circles. The citizens felt it. Ammianus Marcellinus, a historian of the 4th century, lamented the cruelty of tax collectors and the indifference of officials who grew fat on the misery of provinces. He described local elites forced to sell their children into slavery to pay levies, while officials dined comfortably in their villas. These were not barbarians tearing down walls, these were Romans, clothed in Roman dignity, strangling their fellow Romans with parchment chains. And yet, bureaucracy has a strange durability. Walls can be knocked down, but paper trails linger. Even as barbarians pressed at the gates, the offices still hummed, scrolls still copied, officials still argued over jurisdiction. One imagines a clerk in Ravenna continuing to debate the proper form of an edict, while outside, Visigoths sharpened their swords. The empire, in some sense, lived on in the habits of its administrators, an undead creature powered not by vigor, but by paperwork. In this way, the Roman Empire did not simply collapse, it was filed away, archived, catalogued. Its grandeur was reduced to an administrative memory. Later civilizations would inherit not only the ruins of Rome's roads and baths, but also its love of red tape. For what is a medieval chancery or a modern government office but the ghost of Rome's parchment empire still whispering in the shuffle of papers and the stamp of seals? So, if you picture the fall of Rome as a roar, remember also the silence, the scratching of pens, the droning of clerks, the weary sigh of a petitioner told to return tomorrow. An empire can be killed by the sword, yes, but it can also be smothered by scrolls.
If bureaucracy was the slow suffocation of Rome, then religion was its restless transformation. For centuries, Romans had worshipped in a chorus of deities. Jupiter thundering on high, Mars sharpening his sword, Venus whispering in gardens, household spirits guarding kitchen fires. It was a noisy, crowded pantheon, comfortable in its contradictions. A farmer might sacrifice to Ceres for the harvest, and then in the same week slip an offering to Mercury before a business venture. Religion was practical, flexible, transactional. But by the twilight centuries, the empire found itself swept into something altogether different. Christianity, once the persecuted faith of secret meetings and catacombs, rose like a quiet tide until it became not only tolerated, but dominant. Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century cracked the dam, and by the end of that century, the old gods were not simply fading, they were outlawed. The temples that had once thundered with sacrifice were closed. The altars grew cold. This was no small change. Imagine a world where civic life, festivals, parades, even the rhythm of daily business had always revolved around pagan rituals. Suddenly, these rituals were branded superstition. Senators who once paraded in Jupiter's honor were forced to adapt to a faith that spoke not of civic duty, but of salvation, sin, and eternal judgment. The Roman Empire did not merely shift its politics, it shifted its very understanding of the sacred. For many, this was bewildering. The old gods had been woven into the stones of Rome itself. When the Senate met, it did so under the watchful eyes of statues of deities. When generals marched, they carried standards blessed in Jupiter's name. To remove these gods felt, to some, like removing the empire's foundation. And yet, to others, Christianity offered a clarity that the chaotic pantheon never had. One God, one order, one truth. No need to negotiate with fickle, divine personalities. But the transition was not smooth. Pagan shrines were vandalized, temples stripped for marble, priests mocked as relics of foolishness. At the same time, Christian bishops gained authority not only in the spiritual realm, but in politics. By the 5th century, a bishop's influence in a city could rival that of a governor. The empire that had once bowed to its emperors now often found emperors bowing, in subtle ways, to bishops. There is irony here. Rome, which had conquered the known world with legions, was conquered in turn by a religion of humility, forgiveness, and invisible power. And yet Christianity, once inside the imperial bloodstream, adapted to Rome as much as Rome adapted to it. Churches grew monumental, echoing the grandeur of basilicas. Bishops wore robes and carried titles that mirrored senators. The empire baptized itself, but the water was laced with old habits of hierarchy and ceremony. In this sacred reshuffling, one notices a curious detail. The pagans and Christians often looked alike in practice. The poor still sought healing at shrines, only now the shrine might be dedicated to a saint instead of Asclepius. Soldiers still prayed before battle, only now to Christ instead of Mars. Festivals continued, but their names and justifications shifted. The human need for ritual remained constant, only the vocabulary changed. But beneath the surface was tension. In some cities, riots broke out between pagans and Christians. Philosophers, still devoted to the old gods, mocked bishops as zealots. In Alexandria, Hypatia, a brilliant pagan scholar, was murdered by a Christian mob in 415, a chilling sign that ideas themselves had become dangerous. The empire's intellectual life, once proudly pluralistic, narrowed under the weight of religious conflict. At the same time, Christianity offered new comforts to a weary empire, the message of eternal life, of a kingdom beyond this fragile world, resonated with citizens who had watched their empire falter, their crops fail, their armies weaken. Paganism had promised prosperity in this life. Christianity promised redemption in the next. For those living in the twilight of Rome, such a promise must have felt like a candle in the dusk. And with this shift came a redistribution of loyalty. Once the emperor was the sacred figure, Pontifex Maximus, the bridge between mortals and gods. Now bishops and popes claim spiritual supremacy, sometimes clashing with emperors themselves. When Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, forbade Emperor Theodosius from entering church after a massacre, it was clear. The days when emperors ruled unchallenged were gone. The spiritual world had slipped beyond their grasp. The landscape itself testified to the change. Pagan temples were converted into churches, their marble altars rededicated, their columns repurposed. The Parthenon in Athens, once the jewel of pagan worship, became a church of the Virgin Mary. Stone remembers, but stone can also be rescripted, given new meaning while retaining its old shape. The Roman world became a palimpsest, pagan undertexts beneath Christian lines. Of course, not all embraced the shift. In rural areas, the Pagi, from which we get the word pagan, the old gods lingered stubbornly. Farmers muttered their old prayers under the guise of Christian rites. Festivals to Bacchus were disguised as Christian feasts. The church's spread was vast, but never complete. Even in victory, Christianity found itself negotiating with the ghosts of Rome's gods. And perhaps this is the essence of Rome's twilight. Not sudden replacement, but layering. The empire did not simply swap Jupiter for Christ, it wove Christ into the same imperial fabric. Christianity inherited Rome's organization, its legalism, its love of ceremony. In turn, Rome inherited Christianity's sense of the eternal, the invisible, the moral. Each reshaped the other. So in these centuries, as borders frayed and bureaucrats shuffled their parchments,
Something deeper shifted. The very soul of Rome changed. The gods that had once whispered from every temple were silenced. In their place rose the chants of monks, the processions of bishops, the ringing of bells. The empire may have been dying politically, but spiritually, it was being reborn into something that would endure for 1,000 more years in the form of Christendom. The paradox is almost beautiful. Rome crumbled, and yet Rome lived on in every cathedral, every bishopric, every monastery. The sword dulled, but the cross remained. And if you listen carefully, perhaps you can still hear it, the echo of pagan footsteps fading beneath the swell of Christian hymns, as one sacred order dissolved into another.
When historians write of empires, they love to linger on emperors, battles, decrees, and invasions. But the heart of any empire beats in its ordinary citizens, the shopkeepers, bakers, farmers, and children who lived their lives beneath the weight of history without realizing they were part of it. In the twilight of Rome, their days unfolded in patterns that were both familiar and fragile, touched by a sense that the old rhythms no longer quite worked. A late Roman morning still began with the sound of footsteps on stone streets. Markets opened, vendors laid out figs and bread, and children darted between stalls. But if you listened carefully, there was a new undertone. Prices were higher, coins clipped and debased. Bread might be thinner, stretched with husks to make it last. What once was abundance now carried a taste of scarcity. Consider the baker. For centuries, Rome's grain supply had been its pride, the famous annona, feeding the masses with shipments from Africa and Egypt. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, those shipments were less reliable. Pirates prowled the seas, provinces seceded, administrators skinned from the stores. So the baker, who once confident in his supply, now eyed his sacks nervously, hoping the grain would last a week. His customers noticed too. Loaves were smaller, prices higher, tempers shorter. The public baths, another pulse of Roman daily life, still operated in many cities, though with less grandeur. The great imperial complexes of marble and mosaic remained, but fewer repairs were made, fewer fountains flowed. The baths had always been social hubs, places where men discussed politics, gossiped, or simply soaked away their aches. In the twilight years, they became refuges from the outside world's uncertainty, a reminder of a Rome that still pretended to hum along. To step into the caldarium was to feel, briefly, that all was well, that the empire's glory still steamed around you. Yet even here, whispers intruded. Taxes to maintain the baths grew steep, fuel for the furnaces became scarcer. Some bathhouses closed altogether, their halls echoing with emptiness, weeds sprouting through cracked tiles. A Roman walking past such a ruin might feel the odd dissonance of living among monuments too grand for the present to maintain. Daily life became an exercise in navigating between old splendor and new decay. For farmers, life was even more precarious. Once, rural estates flourished, sending produce to distant markets. But as invasions pressed on borders and taxes squeezed harder, many smallholders abandoned their land. The countryside, dotted with villas and fields, began to hollow out. Those who remained often worked not for themselves, but for great landowners, clinging to patronage in exchange for protection. The proud Roman farmer, independent and disciplined, gave way to something more like a medieval serf, bound to soil and lord alike. Children grew up in this shifting world without knowing it was unusual. They played with wax tablets, tossed knucklebones, chased dogs through alleys. They memorized their letters at school, if their parents could still afford tuition. But the classics they recited, Homer, Virgil, Cicero, described the world of triumph and stability that their own streets no longer matched.
Imagine a boy reciting Virgil's lines about Rome's eternal destiny, while outside his classroom, a city wall sagged under neglect. The disconnect must have been sharp, though children are adaptable. Perhaps he simply shrugged and went back to play. In the cities, artisans continued their trades. Smiths hammered iron, potters shaped clay, weavers tended looms. Yet the markets they supplied grew narrower. Long-distance trade, once the lifeblood of Roman luxury, became dangerous as roads deteriorated and brigands prowled. A merchant who once sold silk from the east now struggled to obtain even local wool. Shops survived, but with fewer exotic goods, fewer buyers with coin to spare. Even entertainment changed. The Colosseum still stood, its arches towering, but the spectacles within were diminished. The great gladiatorial games waned as Christianity's influence grew, declaring them cruel. Instead, chariot races at the circus survived, but with an air of desperation. Crowds still roared, colors of teams still mattered, but the empire that hosted them was fraying. An ordinary Roman might still cheer for the blues or greens, yet walk home past crumbling aqueducts and wonder how long the races would last. Religious life, too, pressed into daily routine. Where once a Roman might toss a coin to Mercury before a journey, now he might light a candle before a saint's relic. Churches became the new community centers, offering alms, comfort, and sometimes literal refuge from tax collectors or soldiers. An ordinary Roman woman might find solace there, praying for her children's safety in a world that seemed increasingly fragile. The rhythms of feast days replaced old pagan festivals, offering continuity in the midst of change. And yet, there was resilience. People adapt, they always do. Families adjusted meals, communities supported one another, local leaders stepped in where imperial officials faltered. A city cut off from grain imports might plant new fields. A village abandoned by soldiers might raise its own militia. Ordinary Romans did not simply collapse with the empire. They found ways to keep living. There is poignancy in this. For while historians chart the decline of Rome in sweeping lines, invasions, edicts, reforms, the lived reality was more intimate. A mother baking bread, thinner than before, but still warm. A child laughing in a dusty alley. A craftsman grumbling about taxes, yet still showing up to work. These moments, quiet and stubborn, stitched the fabric of late Roman life. Perhaps the most haunting image is of ordinary Romans walking past their own ruins. A man on his way to market might glance at a temple shuttered, its marble chipped, its steps serving now as a meeting place for beggars. A woman might fetch water from a fountain that sputtered more weakly than it once did. Daily life was a dance between past grandeur and present struggle, between memory and survival. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The murmur of a twilight city. Hooves clattering on uneven stones, merchants shouting over coinless customers, children singing in alleyways, and church bells chiming in place of temple horns. Rome was dying, yes, but life within it went on. Stubborn, ordinary, beautifully mundane.
Rome had always lived with borders. They were the proud edges of the empire, marked by stone walls, fortified camps, and the rhythmic march of patrols. To be Roman was, in some sense, to live within those borders, safe behind the limes that separated the civilized from the wild. Beyond lay forests, steppe, and the countless tribes who had never accepted Roman order. For centuries, the empire had pressed outward, pushing those borders further and further until the Mediterranean was ringed in Roman red. But in the twilight, the pressure reversed. The borders began to bend, and then to fray, until at last they cracked.
Picture Hadrian's Wall in Britain, stretching across the landscape, its stones darkened by rain and moss. Once it had been alive with the tramp of boots, the smoke of campfires, the laughter of soldiers swapping stories in Latin. By the 4th century, many of those soldiers were gone, their pay delayed, their replacements not arriving. The locals whispered of raids, of shadows slipping through forests. The wall still stood, but its spirit sagged. It was a symbol now, not a barrier. Along the Rhine and the Danube, the great rivers that had long held back the tribes, watchtowers crumbled. The Franks, Goths, Vandals, and Huns pressed closer. No longer the distant barbarians of legend, but neighbors who traded by day and raided by night. To live in a frontier town was to live in a state of unease, planting crops one season, fleeing with what you could carry the next. And yet the term barbarian is misleading. The Romans used it to describe anyone beyond their cultural borders. But these were not mindless destroyers. The Goths farmed, traded, raised families. They admired Roman goods, copied Roman fashion, even served in Roman armies. The real tragedy was not that they were fundamentally alien, but that Rome no longer had the strength to absorb them as it once had. In earlier centuries, Rome had welcomed outsiders, granting citizenship, blending cultures, weaving new peoples into its vast fabric. But by the late Empire, that fabric was thin, threadbare. The machinery of integration had rusted, so when whole tribes approached, desperate for land, food, protection, Rome faltered. Negotiations broke down, promises were made and broken, officials bickered. Into this vacuum came chaos. The most famous crack came in 378 at the Battle of Adrianople. The Goths, mistreated and starving within Roman borders, rose in rebellion. The Roman army, led by Emperor Valens, marched to crush them. What followed was a disaster. The legions, once invincible, were annihilated by horsemen and spears. Valens himself perished on the field. The news shocked the empire. Rome had been beaten before, yes, but never like this by a people it had considered manageable. Adrianople was more than a battle. It was a revelation. The borders were not secure. The barbarians were not going away. For the ordinary Roman, these shifts were not abstract. A farmer in Gaul might wake to find his village burned by raiders. A merchant on the Danube might see trade routes cut by warbands. Refugees poured south carrying tales of fire and loss. Cities swelled with displaced people, straining resources already thin. The idea of Rome as eternal, as unbreakable, began to erode in the minds of its own citizens. And yet daily life continued with eerie normalcy in many regions. In Africa, villas still produced olive oil. In the East, cities thrived under Byzantine administration. For someone living in Antioch or Alexandria, the empire might have seemed stable. But in the West, where the frontier cracked again and again, the sense of fragility was inescapable. To live near a border was to know that history might arrive at your doorstep uninvited. The Huns, in particular, brought new terror. They were not farmers seeking land, but nomadic horsemen sweeping across the plains with astonishing speed. To Roman eyes, they seemed like a force of nature, their faces scarred, their bows deadly, their movements unpredictable. Attila's campaigns in the mid-5th century spread fear far beyond the actual battlefields. Whole towns fled at the rumor of his approach. It was not simply invasion, it was panic itself, made flesh.
Yet even here, the story resists simplicity. Many so-called barbarians wanted not to destroy Rome, but to join it, to partake of its wealth, its order, its prestige. The tragedy was that Rome could no longer decide whether to embrace or resist them. One emperor offered land, another revoked the promise. Generals hired Gothic soldiers one year, then fought against them the next. Policy shifted like sand, leaving everyone uncertain. For the ordinary Roman, this meant instability. A Gothic mercenary might defend your town one month and sack it the next. A treaty might bring peace, only to collapse in betrayal. Trust frayed. Loyalty grew thin. Citizens began to look less to distant emperors and more to local leaders, bishops, or landowners for protection. The empire, once a vast umbrella, shrank into smaller shelters. Still, the borders lingered as symbols. Walls, forts, and watchtowers dotted the landscape, reminders of a world that once believed in permanence. A traveler crossing the Rhine might see crumbling stones where legions had stood and wonder how such strength had ebbed away. Perhaps he shrugged, adjusted his pack, and moved on. The stones did not answer. And so the empire's twilight deepened, not with a single catastrophic collapse, but with 1,000 small breaches. Each raid, each migration, each treaty broken or made chipped away at the confidence that Rome was eternal. The frontier, once a proud line, became a blurred space where Roman and barbarian mingled, fought, traded, and intermarried. The categories themselves dissolved. Who was Roman? Who was Gothic? In some villages, the answer was both. This, perhaps, is the quiet truth. Rome was not simply destroyed from without, but transformed from within. The barbarians did not end Rome, they became Rome, as Rome became something else. The frontiers did not vanish in an explosion, they dissolved in a murmur, in the shuffle of migrating feet, in the smoke of abandoned forts, in the silence of rivers no longer patrolled.
Confidence is a fragile thing. Nations do not rise or fall solely on swords, gold, or clever legislation. They rise on a collective belief in themselves, a kind of invisible scaffolding that holds everything together. Once that belief begins to falter, even the sturdiest marble columns start to feel hollow. By the later centuries of the Roman Empire, cracks had appeared not just in the roads or aqueducts, but in the very psyche of Rome itself. The empire still possessed armies, still minted coins, still convened senators in echoing halls, but it no longer believed, quite so deeply, that it was destined to last forever. The Romans of earlier ages had been intoxicated with the idea of their own eternity. They carved the phrase SPQR, Senatus Populesque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome, onto arches, coins, and monuments, as if to remind themselves and the world that Rome was not a passing experiment, but a permanent feature of human history. By the 4th and 5th centuries, though, those same letters looked less like a statement of destiny and more like the graffiti of a people unwilling to accept change. A vast empire that once believed itself eternal now seemed uncertain, half waiting for someone else to tell them what they still stood for. Part of this waning confidence stemmed from the sheer accumulation of crises. A century of plagues, invasions, inflation, and political intrigue had left people weary. Even victories, when they came, seemed temporary, partial, as if only buying time rather than restoring glory. A general might defeat one barbarian army, but another would soon rise. A new tax might fill the coffers, but only at the cost of strangling commerce. It became harder and harder to imagine the empire not as something inevitable, but as something precarious. Confidence frayed because reality refused to behave like destiny. Religion added its own complexities. With the rise of Christianity, the cultural soul of Rome shifted. Once Jupiter and Mars had been invoked as guardians of the state, their temples brimming with sacrifices meant to ensure Roman success. By the 4th century, emperors like Constantine and Theodosius were instead aligning imperial authority with the Christian god. For some, this was invigorating, a fresh moral clarity. For others, it was unsettling. The old gods had been Rome's companions for centuries. To abandon them felt like severing a part of identity itself. In whispered conversations, some wondered if the old gods no longer protected Rome, could this be why the empire suffered defeat after defeat? When Alaric's Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, this unease exploded into open panic. Pagans pointed to the abandonment of Jupiter. Christians argued it was punishment for not being Christian enough. Either way, the sack was less devastating for its material destruction and more for what it did to confidence. For the first time in 800 years, Rome had fallen to outsiders. The aura of invincibility was gone. Bureaucracy, that great Roman specialty, had also grown into a monstrous weight. To maintain an empire of such scale required legions of clerks, scribes, tax collectors, and officials, all endlessly writing, recording, and demanding. The system worked when confidence was high. Bureaucracy can be endured when one believes it is in service of greatness. But when belief faded, paperwork became suffocating. Farmers resented the collectors who bled them dry for a state they no longer felt loyalty toward. Soldiers grew bitter at officers who demanded discipline without providing pay or supplies. Even the elite began to wonder if all this administrative machinery was worth preserving. Confidence withers when every interaction with the state feels less like participation in a noble project and more like being squeezed by an indifferent machine. Even architecture, once a bold proclamation of Roman confidence, began to betray subtle shifts. The triumphal arches became smaller, less ambitious. Basilicas were converted into churches, sometimes with hurried adaptations. Wealthy villas were still built, but they showed signs of contraction. Fewer mosaics, less extravagant baths, recycled materials from older structures. The grandeur of the past was still there in outline, but it was like looking at a fading mural, colors washed out, edges crumbling. Citizens lived among the ruins of their own past glory, and how could that not gnaw at confidence? The army, once the steel backbone of Roman pride, reflected this crisis of morale. Earlier Roman legions had seen themselves as embodiments of discipline and power, soldiers of destiny. By the later empire, many were mercenaries or provincials pressed into service, fighting for pay rather than pride. They still marched, still fought bravely at times, but the old sense of invulnerability had ebbed. When soldiers fight with doubt, battles are rarely won with conviction. The mere fact that emperors increasingly relied on barbarian generals, figures like Stilicho, half Vandal and yet protector of Rome, illustrates how much confidence had shifted. Rome no longer believed only Romans could save Rome. What does the collapse of confidence feel like on the ground? Imagine being a shopkeeper in a provincial town in Gaul. You pay your taxes, though reluctantly, to officials who seem more interested in bribes than fairness. You hear news of raids along the frontier, sometimes pushed back, sometimes not. You see once busy marketplaces thinning, fewer caravans arriving with exotic goods. You pray, though you're unsure whether to light a candle to Christ or leave an offering to Mercury, just in case. You sense that your children may not inherit the same world you did. This subtle erosion of certainty, that is the collapse of confidence, felt in the bones of everyday life. Philosophers and historians of the time noticed it too. St. Augustine, writing after the sack of Rome, tried to console his flock with the idea that the city of God was eternal, even if the city of man was doomed. Ammianus Marcellinus, a pagan historian, chronicled the corruption and excess of Roman officials with a tone that bordered on despair. These were not the confident voices of an empire convinced of its destiny. They were the laments of people trying to make sense of decline. Confidence, of course, does not disappear at once. It decays, in layers, unevenly, like the peeling of old paint. In some places, Roman pride persisted stubbornly. In Constantinople, for example, emperors still paraded with full pomp, still commissioned dazzling churches and walls. Yet even there, the sense of being the unshakable heart of the world had weakened. The Eastern Empire would survive for centuries more, but its confidence was increasingly defensive, cautious, haunted by what had already been lost. The gentle decay of Rome was in many ways the decay of its belief in itself. A people who once proclaimed they were eternal had begun to whisper doubts. And those whispers grew louder than the boasts. When a civilization stops believing in its own story, its end becomes not only possible, but inevitable. It is said that strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create paperwork. Rome, in its twilight, produced a particularly flamboyant breed of weak men. The emperors of these final centuries were not entirely without merit. Some even managed impressive victories or reforms, but their reigns carried the unmistakable scent of improvisation. They ruled not like masters of destiny, but like caretakers of decline, patching holes in a roof while the foundations quietly rotted away beneath them. Earlier emperors had projected an image of almost mythic grandeur. Augustus wrapped himself in divine lineage. Trajan carried himself as conqueror of worlds. Marcus Aurelius looked like a philosopher king straight from Plato's imagination. But the emperors of the later empire often felt like accidental rulers. They came to power through desperate coups, palace conspiracies, hurried votes from frightened armies. Their faces, stamped on coins, looked less like timeless marble and more like tired bureaucrats staring down unpaid ledgers. Consider Honorius, who ruled the western half of the empire during the early 5th century. When news reached him that Rome had been sacked by the Visigoths, he was reportedly distraught, not because the eternal city had fallen, but because he thought someone meant his favorite chicken, also named Roma, had died. This may be apocryphal, but it captures the mood perfectly. The rulers of Rome had become so detached, so insulated, that they could confuse the loss of the world's greatest city with the misfortune of a poultry yard. Then there was Valentinian III, who by all accounts had little appetite for governing and left most matters in the hands of generals and advisors. His reign was punctuated by spectacular disasters, including the sack of Rome in 455 by the Vandals, an event so humiliating that the very word vandalism would be born from it. He himself died not in noble battle, but assassinated in a petty quarrel. It was an undignified end for a man presiding over an undignified age. The Eastern emperors fared somewhat better, their wealthier base in Constantinople giving them more breathing room. Theodosius II built massive defensive walls that would shield the city for nearly 1,000 years. Yet even in the East, emperors felt less like titans and more like caretakers, their achievements defensive rather than expansive. They clung to survival rather than radiated confidence. The role of emperor had shifted from destiny shaper to damage controller. A crucial symptom of twilight emperorship was dependence on outsiders. Generals of barbarian descent, like Stilicho and Ricimer,
often wielded more real power than the emperors themselves. These men could be brilliant commanders, yet their prominence underscored a deeper truth. Rome no longer trusted its own Roman elite to save it. The imperial purple became a costume draped over whichever figure could keep the wolves at bay longest, whether by bloodline, bribe, or sheer force of personality. The empire's shifting geography also betrayed its twilight. No longer was Rome the heart of the empire. Emperors increasingly ruled from Ravenna, Milan, or Constantinople. Rome itself became a ceremonial relic, a city of echoes rather than decisions. The imperial court drifted like a nomadic camp, always searching for defensible ground, leaving behind the idea of a single immovable capital. It was a subtle admission. The eternal city was no longer eternal in practice. Even the rituals of power seemed to lose conviction. The triumphal procession, once a thunderous parade of captured spoils and chained kings, dwindled into empty pomp. Senators still wore their togas, but fewer people cared what they decided. Imperial edicts were still issued with flourish, but increasingly ignored on the ground. Authority persisted in form, but hollowed in substance. Like a candle guttering in its final hours, the light remained, but its strength was faltering. The emperors themselves must have sensed the fragility of their position. Imagine ruling a realm where the tax revenues barely reached the army, where news from the frontiers was almost always bad, and where every victory felt temporary. Imagine commissioning coins with your face, only to know that within months your rival might mint coins with his face. To be a late Roman emperor was to live with a sword above your head, suspended by the thinnest of strings. And yet, despite the chaos, they clung to ceremony. Court life in the twilight years was a world of rigid etiquette. Audiences with the emperor were choreographed with exacting precision. How many times one bowed, how close one stood, what words could be spoken. It was theater, pure and simple, a stage performance of power, even as real power leaked away to the generals and tacksmen. The emperor was still called Dominus and Deus, Lord and God. But in private, many must have realized the title sounded more desperate than divine. The tragedy of the Twilight Emperors is not that they were uniformly inept. Some did show flashes of ability. Diocletian, centuries earlier, had attempted to stabilize the empire with his tetrarchy, dividing power among 4 rulers. Constantine had refounded the empire's center in Constantinople. Even in the West, figures like Majorian briefly tried to revive discipline and reform, but their efforts, however noble, were swallowed by the tide. Their legacies were not empires renewed, but empires momentarily delayed in their collapse. What lingers, then, is the image of men wrapped in purple cloaks, enthroned in marble halls, yet presiding over a world that no longer quite believed in them. They were actors, playing emperors in a play whose ending the audience already knew. The curtain was falling, and no amount of ceremony could disguise it. The Twilight Emperors remind us that decline is rarely sudden. It is not a single battle lost or a single city sacked. It is a series of men and women carrying on the motions of greatness, even as greatness slips silently out the door. Rome did not end with a bang, but with rulers who still called themselves emperors long after the empire had stopped behaving like one. And so, in the fading light, the emperors lingered, half shadow, half symbol, caretakers of a dream slowly dissolving into history.
Decline, when it finally arrives, is rarely thunderous. It does not sweep through the streets with trumpets and banners announcing its triumph. Instead, it seeps like water through cracks in stone, silent and patient,
until one day you look around and realize the walls have collapsed. Rome did not vanish in a single night of flames. It did not fall neatly in 476 when a boy emperor named Romulus Augustulus was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. That date is convenient for textbooks, but the truth is softer, stranger, more like a whisper than a scream. Rome melted away, dissolved into fragments, and the fragments became the soil of something else entirely. Picture the scene in 476. The Western Emperor, Romulus, was little more than a teenager, his name itself a cruel joke of fate. Romulus, like the mythical founder of Rome, Augustulus, the little Augustus, a diminutive title for a diminished ruler. He did not die on the battlefield. He did not march chained in a barbarian triumph. He was simply told to step aside. Odoacer, a barbarian general in service of Rome, removed him, sent him into quiet exile, and declared himself king of Italy. The Roman Senate, weary and pragmatic, sent word to Constantinople, "We don't need two emperors anymore. One in the east is enough." And with that, the Western Empire ended, not with an explosion, but with an administrative memo. If you had lived in Italy at the time, you might not have even noticed. The markets still opened, the aqueducts still carried water, at least those not yet broken, farmers still trudged into fields, priests still conducted services, though now in Christian churches rather than temples to Jupiter. The collapse of Rome did not mean the collapse of daily life. Rather, it was the slow acknowledgement that the people in purple robes no longer mattered. The emperors had become irrelevant before they became extinct. What lingered was not so much a fall as a transformation. Roman law endured, copied into the codes of barbarian kingdoms. Roman roads remained, though some grew wild with weeds. Latin evolved, splintering into the languages we now call French, Spanish, Italian. Roman Christianity, once persecuted, now flourished, carried forward by bishops who became the new arbiters of authority. In this way, Rome never truly ended. It seeped into the fabric of Europe, hiding in cathedrals, in manuscripts, in the very grammar of speech. The fall of Rome was, in some ways, simply Rome changing clothes. But still, one must imagine the psychological weight of it. For centuries, men and women had believed they were citizens of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Their coins said so, their monuments said so, their history said so. And then, gradually, they were not. To go from being Roman to being Gothic or Vandal or Frankish was not merely a shift in administration. It was the end of a story, the unraveling of an identity. Imagine a proud family discovering that their ancient name no longer opens doors, that their ancestors' triumphs are now footnotes in someone else's tale. That is what the last Romans must have felt. Even in the East, where the empire endured for another 1,000 years under the name Byzantium, the shadow of loss loomed. Constantinople might survive, even thrive, but it no longer commanded the West. The old unity was gone. What remained was a narrower, more defensive empire, brilliant in its own right, but forever haunted by the ghosts of its Western twin. The Byzantines themselves never called their empire anything but Roman. They considered themselves true heirs. Yet, deep down, they must have sensed that the idea of Rome as the world's eternal ruler had slipped away. Archaeology tells us the ending better than chroniclers. In Britain, villas once bustling with Roman life became ruins taken over by weeds. In Gaul, amphitheaters were repurposed into fortresses, their grandeur bent toward survival. In Spain, the fine pottery of Roman workshops gave way to rougher local wares. Civilization did not disappear, it adapted. But the refinement, the confidence, the sheen of universality was gone. The world had become smaller, humbler, more local. Rome's vast web of unity had snapped. And yet, whispers remained. A medieval monk copying a Latin manuscript by candlelight was unknowingly carrying forward the legacy of Cicero. A Frankish king who styled himself consul was borrowing Rome's ghostly authority. Even barbarian warlords who plundered Roman lands sometimes wrapped themselves in Roman titles, as though conquest alone was not enough. They needed Rome's dignity too. Rome lingered not as an empire, but as a dream that refused to die. It is tempting to ask, why did it fall? Was it decadence, as moralists claim? Was it barbarian invasion, as chroniclers insisted? Was it plague, climate, economics, bureaucracy? The truth is all of these and none of them. Empires are not felled by single blows. They dissolve when the stories people tell themselves no longer hold. Rome's fall was in the end the slow collapse of belief. Belief in invincibility, belief in order, belief in Rome itself. When that belief faded, the empire did too. Perhaps that is why the story of Rome's fall still fascinates us. It is not simply about antiquity, not simply about barbarians and emperors. It is about the fragility of greatness, the knowledge that even the mightiest can become whispers. We look at Rome and see, uncomfortably, a mirror. If it could happen to them, lords of the known world, architects of aqueducts, masters of armies, could it not happen to us? That is why the fall of Rome is never entirely past. It is always a cautionary tale hovering in the background of every civilization that dares to call itself eternal. So in the end, Rome did not die. It faded. It decayed gently, like marble exposed to rain, its outlines blurred, its colors muted, its features softened until only the suggestion of its former grandeur remained. And in that gentle decay, it became something new. Rome lives on not in emperors or armies, but in whispers, in languages, in laws, in ruins scattered across hillsides, in the faint pride of people who still call themselves heirs to an ancient dream. The empire is gone, but its echoes remain. Perhaps that is all eternity really means. Not endless survival, but the power to whisper across centuries. Rome whispers still, if you lean closely enough to listen.